Most of you are familiar with when Israel was wandering through the desert. For 40 years they wandered. They failed to obey God, and so they wandered in the desert. Instead of entering the promised land, the land the Bible calls a land flowing with milk and honey. And the first 5 books of the Bible, for the most part, deal with that time where Moses was given the commandments, and they passed that on to Israel. Israel had witnessed the parting of the Red Sea. They had walked through the waters, the walled waters. They had watched Egypt, the Egyptians, be swallowed up by the same sea that they walked right through. They had witnessed the miraculous signs, the 10 plagues God did against Egypt. They watched as manna manifested from heaven and fed them out in the middle of the desert, this miraculous provision of God every single morning, every single day. They watched as God's presence went with them in a cloud by day and a fire, a flame by night. They visually saw God's manifested presence. And of course they drank from the rock that miraculously provided water in the dry and parched wilderness that they found themselves in. Yet Israel often failed to obey God. They just failed to obey over and over. And they did the exact opposite of everything God told them to do. Sometimes we say, well, if I could just, God, if you just give me a sign, then I will X, Y, Z. And it's like, no, that's not going to work per se. Everything has to be done by faith. Israel had plenty of signs. And if we're honest, we've seen the signs ourselves. So, what is it that caused them, better yet, what is it that causes us as God's people to spend time wandering around in the dry, parched wilderness, the deserts, when we are promised the land of milk and honey? What is it? I believe it is in big part, and I suffer from this too, it's remembering that Jesus is with us. It's just that. We forget. So my question for us this morning as we begin this message is are we in tune with the fact that we are at all times in the presence of Christ? We are at all times in the presence of Christ. Our message this morning, it comes out of 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We're going to be focused in on verse 4, but 1 Corinthians chapter 10, and it's in the New Testament, although we're going to be looking at Christ, Jesus, in the Old Testament. And then we're going to say what we should do as a result. And then we'll finish. For I do not want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. You know, I've often heard it said that the God of the Old Testament is like this harsh, cruel, judging tyrant. But the God in the New Testament, Jesus, he is this forgiving, compassionate, loving God. And so we kind of have these two different gods there. But that's not the way it is. It's not an accurate assessment. Jesus was there in the Old Testament. He was with God's people from the beginning. He didn't show up at the virgin birth. He didn't begin as a babe. He was, as the author of Hebrews puts it, Jesus Christ was the same yesterday, today, and forever. He always was. We know Christ was present with Israel because right here in Corinthians, Paul says that the rock traveling with Israel in the wilderness was actually Christ. Verse 4 says, and all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. The rock was Christ. So, some translations say this rock accompanied them. Some say it traveled with them. What is he talking about? And old Jewish traditions, it was like the rock literally followed them around. Maybe similar to the way the fire and the cloud. But most modern scholars don't say that. But that was the Jewish tradition, and it could be that this rock miraculously went everywhere with them. But what's going on there is there's 2 times in the Old Testament that this water providing rock is mentioned. The first time it is in Exodus, and God gave Moses the commandment to take the staff that he used to touch the Nile and turn the Nile River into blood, to take that staff and to smite or strike this rock, because all of Israel was out in the desert and complaining to Moses that they didn't have any water to drink. And so they're going, hey, you led us out here to the wilderness and we're about to die of thirst. And so Moses goes to God and he says, look, these people are going to stone me. What do I do? And he says, take that staff, strike the rock, water's going to come out. And this miraculous provision of water comes out of a rock, comes out of somewhere it should have never been. So, the second time, there's 2 times I said. The second time, it's almost identical, it's in Numbers, and God tells Moses, get that staff, but he doesn't say strike it this time. He says, now go talk to that rock. Just speak to it. And he does the same. Oh, no, he doesn't do the same. He takes the staff, he doesn't obey, and he strikes it. And as a result, he is disciplined by God. And Moses didn't get to enter the promised land because of that. That's a whole other side story. But for now, it's enough to say this rock, 2 times it's mentioned, they're identical in nature, except for 1 time Moses struck it like he was supposed to. The second time he struck it and he wasn't supposed to. And as a result, he was punished. So my question is, Christian, are we obeying God in the details?